Welcome, people. Welcome, welcome, welcome. But yeah, it was always a, to do theater. I was in Oak Park actually at Village Players when I was 5 years old. Was the first time that I worked, and it was I played either Ignorance or Greed in the Christmas Carol. I don't remember, and it was always a way to like exist and be what I know I truly was, this little brown cross-eyed queer thing.
Yeah.
You know, and it gave me a way to exist and be that was really, really healing for me, not even knowing that was what I needed. Coming from this super macho Puerto Rican, like, dad had like five children born with a penis, and so treated us all as like, you gotta do sports and women and, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Hi, Eric Gang.
Oh my God, we've got people coming in.
Amy Johnson is here again.
Oh, yay!
She wrote a nice email about, I believe, about the talk from last week with Aiga.
Yay!
Hamilton.
David Hamilton, Janelle Dawkins, Kelly Sketchy, Sierra Johnson, hello.
Welcome, people.
Tamara Wendrick.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. We got a nice little crowd forming, and I'm pushing buttons. I'm trying to up, oh, my chair sank.
And there will be time for questions at the end.
Oh, great.
So when that happens, folks can put it in the chat.
Okay.
As opposed to here on the participants. Well, shall we begin? We're here.
Please.
We'll begin. Yay. This is Mika Cole, everybody. Hooray. We're so delighted she's here. I am just going to say a quick welcome. Hello. I am Rachel Patterson. I'm the director of Acting Studio Chicago. Welcome and thank you for coming to the 12th episode of the ASC webinar series. Our mission, because I've been thinking about, I have to have a mission. That's what people tell you. You have to have a mission, vision. And so our mission with this series truly is to provide Chicago acting community free ways to connect, learn, and engage during the pandemic. So I hope we are succeeding with that. Let us know if you have ideas for topics you'd like us to address in the future. I hope that you're all staying positive, you're staying healthy, and you're wearing a mask, even on the bike path, where they're not. Tonight, Esteban Andres Cruz interviews theater producer and activist Mika Cole. Originally from Chicago, Mika has worked with Teatro Luna, Impact Theater, Collaboration, Writers Theater, as the executive director of Free Street Theater, and most recently as the repertory producer of Oregon Shakespeare Festival. So she knows her stuff. Mika has successfully advocated for a diverse and inclusive slate of writers, directors, designers, and I said and directors twice, and actors, while during her career and certainly while at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. They will be talking about inclusion and representation in the American theater. I am thrilled for tonight's conversation. I'm excited to watch. And so now I will hand the virtual mic to Esteban. I am making him host with the power of technology. Change a host. And now, yes. All right. Have a terrific talk. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
And thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yes, my friend Mika, I'm so happy to have you with us here and all of the wonderful things that we've been talking about for a long time, that we get to talk about it on this platform, which is just one of many conversations and part of actions that will be had as we venture into the future of theater, reimagining it and reshaping it to be the beautiful thing that represents who we truly are as a species and a race of human beings. So I'm really excited about that. And in addition to all the wonderful things that Rachel was saying, just something to point out about your prolific career is that at each of these two places, which Free Street you spent 5 years at, and OSF was 7 years, And the experiences couldn't be more diverse between those two things, being part of a large regional, very commercial national theater center, and then a smaller, more grassroots organization. And for those of you out there that don't know, Free Street Theater is a Chicago theater that's been around since the 50s. I mean, they've been.
1969.
When was it?
Since 1969.
Mira. So, and during that radical period, they were a theater company that was dedicated to the communities, to Black and brown communities, and for queer people, and specifically not in like mainstream, you know, where Northside Theater normally is. This is for this group of people that normally doesn't get represented, which could not be more different than OSF, although OSF is pretty broad representation as well. And at OSF, you were part of, as a producer, worked on many different productions, including dozens of transfers and co-productions with other theaters, including Lynn Nottage's Sweat, that went on to Broadway and at the Public Theater and on Broadway, as well as Row, which went on to Arena Stages and Berkeley Rep. So I can't imagine any leader in American theater that would have a broader and more expansive vision of what actually American theater is. And that's so exciting to have you here in your specific vantage point. But now I want to wheel back in time and go back in the day to where I know, and maybe not a lot of people out there, not a lot of listeners know that, you also were an actor at one point. And yeah, and one of the roles that you played, girl, I did my research, was Marisol.
Marisol, it's
yes,
true.
In Jose Rivera's play. Iconic play about a post-apocalyptic world that seems to be very reflective of the world that we're living in now. Do you see a lot of, and there's so much when you approach Marisol that is like, how do we define this in terms of what we know and what we understand to be everyday life? How do we understand this dreamscape? But it seems like now that this iconic play from Jose Rivera is now pretty well describes the state that we're living in right now. Would you agree that to that statement being somewhat true?
Yeah, prophetic, I would say. I mean, we certainly are in this just bizarre dystopian reality. It is true that my guardian angel is a Black woman in my real life, so I can play. I mean, there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah. It's crazy. And you know, and we're here today to talk a lot about representation. And there's been a movement by the theater community and even in the arts industry in general. We've seen over the past 10 years a call for more diversity, a call for EDI. And that's every big main theater, and even Oscars So White, everything. There's been a call out that there's been a lack of representation in our industry, in film, TV, and theater all across the board. And most recently, we're seeing a movement from, a national movement from these same artists called We See You, calling for more diversity and representation. But we've been having this conversation now for quite some time. And it seems to really benefit certain organizations that are part of that larger conglomerate of regional theaters, where they'll get a good portion of funding for a diversity initiative that lasts maybe for the month of February, when we'll do a Black production, you know, focus on the African-American stories in this country. And yet there are other institutions in this country that have been working in these Black and brown communities that see only a margin of those funds for the programming that they do to serve these communities. So now that we're in the pandemic and there's no theater happening, what do you see for the future of this representation and the future of theater and the way that it goes?
Yeah, wow, that's a good question. I mean, I just want to second your comment that we've been having this conversation for a very long time, and there are plenty of organizations led by Black folks, Indigenous folks, other people of color, who from inception have been doing the work of diversifying the stories on stage and telling stories that don't get told at these large regional theaters. And it absolutely is frustrating that historically white institutions get gold stars for doing something that folks have been doing for quite a long time. I'm really excited right now because I feel that, you know, I remember about 10 years ago, I was so frustrated as a practitioner in the field because I didn't have the language to quite articulate it yet, but I was frustrated by this notion of representation because at that time I felt that representation was too, it was too easy of a kind of window dressing for institutions. And I knew that we needed to go beyond just putting the bodies on stage. And I think we're at a point in the conversation where representation alone is insufficient. It has always been insufficient. And not to say that it wasn't an important accomplishment. You know, I wanna just hold up and honor the generations before me who worked their asses off, who fought for us simply to exist on the stage, right? That was an important step. But so many institutions thought that was the end, and really was only the very beginning. Right. So I'm excited because I feel like, look, the curtain is really being pulled back. Not only is representation insufficient, but people are actually, you know, kind of pulling away all the smoke and mirrors of the rhetoric that these institutions have now developed, right? Because everybody has the language. Everybody knows how to say Black Lives Matter. Everybody wants to use the word white privilege and white supremacy. I remember not long ago when those words led to conversations with HR, right? But now everybody has the rhetoric and the vocabulary, and that has become a little bit of window dressing too. And I feel like we're at this moment where all of that is being dismantled and people see right through it. And we have to get through those smoke, you know, that smoke and mirrors to get to holding organizations accountable. And I feel like that's where we are right now.
Yeah, that's a really great point about the representation being insufficient, because it seems like the goalpost keeps getting moved, you know. Like we'll make a little advancement, there will be, and what we're really fighting for at the end of the day is human dignity, just to be seen as humans with actual human needs and human wants and that we're all the same, right? It's a very we are the world kind of end goal. But in each of these stages of representation, there's been a political influence, and there's been a kind of like, I remember the colorblind phase where like everything was like Christmas Carol, where like it doesn't matter, we can have an Asian mother and a Black father, and Tiny Tim is, you know, Indian, and it was like this kind of we are the world, kind of like we just ignore that racism exists. And so
it was multiculturalism, right? That was the multiculturalism was the thing. That was like yeah, absolutely. Right.
And that was like an earlier stage in our development, and it took a while for people to understand that multiculturalism is just like in tandem with when people say, I don't see color. Because colorblind casting, I don't see color, is the same thing. And that's just an active ignorance of, well, I'm not that I don't see color, but I am impervious to the trials and tribulations of somebody existing in a Black or brown body. So I don't see it because I don't have those experiences. Whereas somebody who looks like you or I walking through the world, we're constantly reminded about our skin tone by other people, you know, because of that experience. So I totally agree, and I feel like it's very necessary in order to get closer to equality, to push the boundaries of what we deem representation. Now, as we move closer toward that goal, and we're getting more articulate about what those goals are, I feel like it's very similar for what's happening in the trans community, because right now, you know, there's an agenda to be seen as human, and don't paint trans people as this, you know, this monolith of we're all this one thing, or where every time you have a trans character they have to die in it, or, you know, whatever the thing is. And so it's just like a lot of actors sometimes ask me, what do you think about typecasting? In fact, I think we had that question last week or the week before. And I'm like, honey, typecasting, yes, I'm for it, because it means you're working. And when you're working, you have a type to play against. So it's a similar double-edged sword when we talk about representation, because sure, it's great that our bodies are on stage and that, but what are the narratives that we're being told to portray? And what is it? Is it for the benefit of an audience to say that they saw a show with Black and brown people, but they didn't feel threatened at all? Is that the objective? Or is it to expand their sense of humanity? So how do we move from going from representation to authenticity in representation, and showing and having some agency about the stories and the portrayals that we have that are being told on these stages? Is that a call to Black and brown artists to, even if you're an actor, to become a writer? Or is there more power in the domain of the work that you do as a producer? Like, who really holds that power, and how do we change not only what is represented, but the types of representations that we see on stage?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important when we talk about social justice in the American theater that we remember that the stage is one part of it. And it's a core part of it, absolutely. But we've got to talk about what the experiences are for Black and brown bodies off stage, backstage, in the lobby, in the administrative building, in every part of the institution. Because when we're relegated to one part of the organization, right, essentially ghettoized within an institution, we continue to suffer the indignities of oppression. They just look different, right? So I think that we've really got to push for participation and shared power and shared leadership at every level of the institutions, right? So it isn't just about the stories that are being told. It's about who's telling them, and who's telling them at every level, right? Not just the actors or the directors, but the designers, the artists, the people in marketing, the education department, the development department, right? Everybody that works in the theater is part of telling a story, or many stories in any given year. And so we have to make sure that the power is balanced in terms of what perspective is represented when those stories get told. I really, and I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing people of color, Black and Indigenous folks in institutions really pushing organizations to go above and beyond their sort of, you know, minimal commitment to just having our bodies exist. It's like, what is the experience like once we're there?
That's great. And I, you know, the push to have representation, not just on stage, but in every capacity that we see, that we experience in the theater. If you have a Black artist working in your theater, what is their experience like working with the box office?
That's right.
When they're interacting with them. You know, when we have talkbacks, and if the audience is not used to seeing stories about trans people, but you have trans performers on stage, how do we protect those trans artists while they're voluntarily answering these questions that are talk back, if somebody you know, asks something that is harmful or phrased in a way that is in you know, for lack of a better term, an attack. So
yeah, how do we make sure trans artists aren't directly responsible for the personal growth and development of individual audience members who may walk in with a whole host of bigotries? I mean, I think institutions have an obligation to think about justice even at that level, right?
Mm. And there's so many things that an institution can do. And there are a number of different organizations that can come in as a consultant to teach you about making your institution more anti-racist and more anti-oppression. And there are books, and there's all kinds of education and all kinds of things that that people can do now to work towards that goal.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and I'm curious about this, what is the necessary representation? Is it to be reflective of the community that they serve? Because even within the We See You movement, the call to action is to all of these essentially white-led institutions. And so typically these audiences are a majority white, and they're also in communities that are serving to that demographic as well. So it's a whole different conversation when we talk about these arts institutions that exist in Black and brown communities. And so, like, will they be reflective of the demographic? So if we have an arts organization that's on the West Side in Little Village, you know, is that going to be, I would imagine that we want to see in every staff level, executive level, front of house, back of house, that we want to see that reflected in the percentage of the population. So if it's 80% Latino, I would hope that there would be a large portion of that Latino as well as the audience. But in these communities where you got these big national theaters downtown and in uptown, can we base that on the same kind of demographic? Because it doesn't match up if we're looking, or is it, if you choose to tell stories of people of color, then, I mean, how do we figure out what that math is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's based on the community that you're in, because that gives way too many organizations a pass at just staying white and upholding white supremacy, right? Because segregation is still a thing, right? Like, we live in a really segregated city. And there are entire states that are, you know, severely segregated. So I think that I can only speak for myself, and of course that's obvious, but it feels important to say, because I can't tell you how many white folks I've upset because they are upset by the level of conviction with which I speak. So let me just make it really clear. I'm speaking for Mica. I think it's important to look at what the hell is going on in the world at large. To look at the stories that have been notably absent from your season. Obviously, to look at the communities that have been historically oppressed in your community, outside of your community, by your audience members. And what I mean by that is, if you have a predominantly white audience, white people have oppressed a lot of groups of people, right? So, I mean, so I think it's important to look at those stories and make sure those stories are told with the highest level of integrity possible. So I think we have to be careful about a numbers game, because I have certainly worked at and with institutions that are constantly looking at people as quotas, you know what I mean, and percentages. And boy, does that really dehumanize folks,
Yeah.
right? It's such a distortion of what the real purpose should be. And it's not about numbers, it's not about quota, although those things have been useful in holding institutions accountable. At the end of the day, it's about the mission of your organization, the reason why we tell stories. And if we're all on the same page, and the reason why we tell stories is to make this world a better place where there's a lot of shit that needs to get better.
Amen. Amen.
Right?
Yeah. The highest level of integrity. That is such an nebulous term, and also with not wanting to use metrics as a system for determining what our representation is. I also I feel some concern with the highest level of integrity.
Yeah.
With that phrase, because like if someone has all the best intentions, and really wants to do a Black show, or a show about Latinos, and they have the best of intentions, but they're not of that experience, whatever that experience is, fill in the blank, they may be operating under what they perceive as the highest level of integrity, and yet, because of blinders that they might not even be aware of, there are failures and there are blind spots and there are mishaps.
Yeah.
So when those things happen, what's to do? What do we do? Do we burn it down? Do we cut them off and say, you're a horrible person, you're going to hell? Or is there an opportunity to learn and grow? Like what do we do, and how do we raise that bar? And how do we, when there's stories being told about our people, how do we instill a sense of what that integrity is for us to people? And I mean, like right away, I want to answer myself and say, take that out of their hands and be like, we tell the stories, not you.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm so glad that you said that, because there are so many wonderful, well-intentioned folks who tell stories that they have no business telling in ways that are harmful, right? And that in ways that reify stereotypes and problematic narratives. For me, when I think about working with the highest level of integrity, that is about operating from a set of core values. And first and foremost, I work from my own personal core values. And if ideally, my core values are in alignment with the core values of the institution. Now, I've worked at institutions where I've had to push for those core values to be in alignment with mine, or I couldn't work there. You know what I mean? Like the cognitive dissonance is too much, so something had to change, and it wasn't going to be me. But I do think that working from integrity is about having core values and making sure that every decision that you make is filtered through those core values. So if you value shared power, what does that look like in a creative process? And what does that look like in a creative process is a very complicated question, because within our processes, especially in the regional theater, there's all kinds of power dynamics, there's hierarchy, right? There are rules, there are union regulations. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, right? And so those are real obstacles to moving through that value of shared power. But you do the best that you can, right, of applying that. And what does shared power mean? For me, it means if we're telling a story about a community that isn't even represented in our institution, that lacks integrity. And we have to deal with that. We can't work around that. Because if there's a it certainly is not by accident. Nothing is by accident. It's not neutral, right? So that means that there are real, tangible barriers and forms of oppression that's keeping an entire group of people out of our organization. And we need to look at that. And in my opinion, until we look at that, until we deal with that, we have no business telling this story.
Amen.
We have no business telling stories about Black liberation when Black people are not liberated within our own organization. We have no business telling stories about Latinx folks when we won't even post bilingual signage in our lobby. You know what I'm saying? Like, so to me, when I say highest level of integrity, I mean, there's gotta be alignment and follow through from your core values all the way to the work that's on stage and everywhere in between.
That's beautiful. I love that. And it, you know, it reminds me of what my mentor, Kevin Aiga Jeff, instructs us to do, which is very similar to what you're saying, but he just says it as the spirit. He's like, if you check your spirit and your spirit is in line, and you go to your board meetings and you go to your staff and you go not from a metric standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint, and if you know that things are aligned for you spiritually, then you'll be able to do that. And I think it's just saying the same thing that you're saying about core values, but with the invoking the ephemeral and the spiritual element of our existence as human beings.
Absolutely. And it's, look, it's I'm not going to pretend that we don't operate in a commercialized, commodified, capitalist paradigm, right?
Right.
We do. People pay money to see a play. People get paid to do the work. And there is a spiritual cost to that.
Right.
There simply is. There's a spiritual cost to that. And that makes it all the more challenging to be in alignment with one's spirit, because you cannot participate in a capitalist paradigm without oppressing somebody.
Ooh.
To participate in capitalism is to participate in other people's oppression.
Girl.
Even if you are part of an oppressed group, even for me. So in recognizing that, you know, I have to try to find the, I have to balance those things, you know, I have to deal with the cognitive dissonance of that truth in order to work with the highest level of integrity, but also participate in the system that lacks integrity altogether, right?
Amen. Yeah, and I think what you're saying is a recognition of one's own privilege, right?
Yeah.
And like, you know, I'm not a cisgender person, but a lot of people will look at me and assume that I'm just a male, that I'm just a man, and misgender me all the time. And I know that if I don't tell them or correct them, or even if I'm just walking down the street, I am less at threat for my life because people identify me as being male. You know, whereas if I was perceived as being a woman walking down the street, that is a privilege. That is the privilege of the penis, as I like to say.
Yeah.
So recognize one's own privilege. And I think that what we have a lot within the theater community is that all of us working at these predominantly white institutions, we all have, most of us have gone to college, you know. If you were exposed to theater and you're immersed in theater, where was it that you first got your, you know, your formal, you know, I never went to school for theater, but most people who engage with theater, go to theater, participate in theater, have the privilege of having an education. And for a lot of people, that is a privilege, you know? So like right there, there's something that that we can use as our own measure of checks and balances. you know, and one thing that you were talking about with when theaters do shows about people who are communities that have not been represented, if you're going from your core values and from your spiritual integrity, and you're speaking for a group of people that hasn't been represented, we're now throwing around this term BIPOC, which I'm a big fan of, because it's inverted it's not just people of color, but we're saying Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And I think that, for me, says, well, Black people and Native people in this country have really gotten the short shrift of the stick in this, as far as oppression is concerned. You know, this country was built on the backs and the bodies of Black and Native Americans. And with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, you know, this demand for equality, thank God it's happening right now. But it concerns me that we've moved up Indigenous people to the front of the line, but we're not really holding space for them when we're talking about this representation. We're talking about theaters where it's very seldom that there are stories about Native American people told on our stages.
Absolutely.
And we, you know, and I love that we have the word BIPOC. And so I hope that my ambition is that this isn't just hyperbole, but that we actually do some active work to hold space for that community, because that is one privilege that we all have. If you are American and you are, you know, you're born in this country, or you come here and you live off of the convenience of what it means to be American, that was built on the backs of Natives and Blacks in this country. If you eat of this soil, it is steeped in the blood of Native Americans and Africans. So that's a part of who we are, and that's a part of our cultural history as Americans, and part of our guilt, you know? So I would love for the future to see more stories about Native Americans and more land acknowledgements, and not just to have this nice new term for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but I would like that to stand for an action. And you and I had a conversation the other day that was really exciting, about, you know, when we talk about this representation and filling quotas, and this call that I'm making for more Indigenous voices and stories on stage, we'll get pushback from people, and they'll say, well, we can't find anybody, or, you know, we can't find a Black woman with those qualifications, you know, she's not qualified.
Just you saying it is stressing me out. Maybe drink some water.
So,
go on.
So we just can't find that. We can't find that specific person to do that. So I just don't know what we're gonna do, because when we tell trans stories, like, this is the reason why so many cisgender people have gotten to play trans roles, because we couldn't find the trans actor that had the training or whatever. And yet we saw a production of Charm in New York, directed by Will Davis, with an almost exclusively trans cast, which was really exciting. And like, I want to be like, tell me they don't exist. So I know you have feelings on that.
Oh man, first of all, I am with you. Beyond holding space, we need to have more Indigenous folks in positions of power in the American theater, because there's a kind of weird sentimentalism that I think white institutions have about telling Native stories, like it's a museum piece, and it's just part of that, like, it's part of the erasure of Indigenous folks. And so is this whole narrative that we can't find Indigenous folks, right? It's just part of this ongoing bullshit, oppressive narrative that Indigenous folks don't exist. And we know it's bullshit. And so, you know, when we were talking the other day, I think the thing that got me fired up was, you know, you were talking about holding space. Like, okay, you have a position, you have a role, and you are unable to fill this role with an Indigenous person. So you hold, you keep it open, you hold those resources until you do find a person, right?
And
or
invest it in a reservation or create a pipeline, create a mentorship program. You know?
Yeah. And you know, my initial reaction to that was, fuck that, because before we get to holding space, because holding space assumes that these white institutions have actually done the work of looking for Indigenous folks to fill positions. Holding space assumes that white institutions have done the work of ensuring that they are not the arbiters of what qualified means, that they don't get to dictate what the qualifications are. Because when that happens, they put all kinds of unnecessary barriers in place, as we know, which is just part of ongoing oppression. Until motherfuckers have looked for Indigenous folks, like my friend Sharifa Joka says, in the way that they look for their damn keys, right? When you look for your keys, you move everything in the damn house. You look everywhere. You look in places that you know probably, you know what I'm saying? You're gonna move the refrigerator, you're gonna move the couch, you're gonna tear up the carpet, you're gonna
look in the grill in the backyard. You will look in your barbecue grill for your keys.
You will excavate the whole house. Until we have done that, I can't have no conversation about holding space, because holding space allows white institutions to feel good and, you know, get a little sticker for the efforts that they have made. Meanwhile, they get to continue to pretend to be confused about why they can't. And I have no patience for white confusion. There is no confusion. It is not that complicated. So I believe in holding space. I just can't get there with white institutions yet, because they have a whole bunch of other shit they need to do first before we start to solemnly hold space. Like, you know what I'm saying? Holding space to me feels like a funereal procession, right? It's like, no, motherfuckers, we're not done. We're not done looking. You haven't looked. And if you have looked, we need to go back and look at who is deciding who gets to get hired, who wrote the job description, who's determining the qualifications, and what kind of unnecessary bullshit is holding folks out of these institutions. So I don't know. I think that so often this conversation lives in the realm of like, you know, like a spiritual evolution of institutions. Like, we're gonna hold space because that's spiritually the right thing to do. And we do have to work on a spiritual level.
Yeah.
But I think that because white institutions they have some spiritual homework to do. You know what I mean? Because they have some spiritual homework to do. In the meantime, there are practical fucking steps that can be taken to make our institutions more equitable and more just. And I don't want them to be let off the hook by simply making land acknowledgements and holding space. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm gonna shift gears really quick because I do want to talk about and before we're done, we do need to talk about Carla Stillwell and her amazing work. She's brilliant, and she's gonna be on the show in a couple of weeks. But I talking about representation and the work that needs to be done. And I think earlier you mentioned something about like a museum piece, and all these things kind of like trigger in my head the idea of the way that Shakespeare is done in this country, and especially at white institutions, or even when we see like the Black version or the Latino version of a Shakespeare play. It's usually done with the hat is tipped towards Europe and towards a British dialect. Even if it's an American, the stage standard dialect is a British dialect, okay? It is. And everybody has that lilt of it. And whenever I see, I'm so bored watching Shakespeare at some big theaters, we know who they are, I won't mention their names, but basically all of them. And it's so boring because what I'm really seeing is people proving that they've earned their degree at whatever institution they were popped out of, where they know how to speak the T's and the folio and the plus and the but and the dirt and the but. So it's not that kind of theater that I actually engage with, which is humans going for one another and fighting for what they want and what they need, but people proving that they're saying these words right. And I feel like that's a relic and part of this oppressive heritage of what we deem classic art and classic theater in America. And I think that Shakespeare and the way that it is presented and performed in this country has a good, strong hold on preserving oppression and white supremacy in this country. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Full stop. Full stop.
So I'm really interested in seeing Shakespeare done in a way that I just haven't seen it done. And oh my God, I'm so mad because I can't remember the director who just did The Much Ado at the Rep in the summer in the park. God damn it, I can't remember his name. But that brilliant production I did not get to see because I was working as well. But yeah, I would love to see. To me, the thing about Shakespeare that makes him a genius is that he was talking about eternal truths about what it means to be human, not what it means to be white. And so I don't want to see people elevating some standard that is not American to be like, this is high art because I talk funny, but that it's high art because these are human things. And so I'd love to hear people who live in Humboldt Park and speak the way that we do in Humboldt Park talk about that. I'd love to hear Chicanos and Mi Villita speaking in their own dialect, speaking English, speaking in Spanish, and telling these Shakespeare stories just like us, but not trying to prove that we know it well enough the way that white people told us that we were supposed to by these whatnot. So how do we reclaim that that theater and say that no, Shakespeare was for all of us?
Gosh, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I have to say that Shakespeare grew on me during my time as the repertory producer at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, because I remember when I interviewed for my position, and one of my greatest flaws is that I simply cannot lie. And I remember someone asking me if I liked Shakespeare or loved Shakespeare, and I remember saying, you know, I really don't care about Shakespeare that much at all. I mean, and it was the truth. I didn't. And they hired me anyway, which I'm glad that they did. And it's not like I have an irreverence towards Shakespeare. It's that up until that point, my experience of Shakespeare was absolutely what you named. It was just a tool to uphold these kind of white supremacist Western theatrical standards that were not interesting to me as an artist. And one of the things I loved about working at OSF is that there was, and still is, I think, an approach to Shakespeare that is about many different kinds of people being able to own that language and own those texts, and to be able to tell those stories in ways that are just, I don't know, emotionally muscular. And so Shakespeare started to grow on me because there was a different level of interrogation, and because I really started to fall in love with Shakespeare, the activist, like the subversive, like the shit starter. You know what I mean? The shit starter, I roll with real hard. You know what I mean? Shakespeare, the populist, like that's who I mess with. And I think there's a place. Look, I think there's a place for the Black version of the Scottish play, the Latin. I think there's a place for it. I think what is challenging for me about the fight for us to be able to tell the stories that Shakespeare wrote is that it feels to me in part like an ongoing effort to prove our humanity, right? That if we can perform Shakespeare and if we can transcend race, which I'm not interested in, but right, if we can transcend race, if white folks can come see all of these Black people on stage in the Scottish play and see how universal this story is, then maybe they'll believe in our humanity. And I don't even know if I'm supposed to be using profanity on here, but what the thought in my head was, fuck what they believe. You know what I mean? Like, fuck what they believe. And so, to me, if we're gonna tell these stories, we should be able to tell these stories with irreverence, with joy, with, you know what I mean? With really, we should tear it up and rearrange it and move it around. You know, it should not have to be this precious thing that we hand over on a platter and say, look how well behaved we are.
Yes.
I personally am not interested in that. But I do think that the other part of it is I feel that I'm interested in excavating our own classics, our own, you know, and our own great writers, and performing those stories with extraordinary production values, or conversely, performing those stories with just bodies. I feel that, I don't know, it's difficult. I feel like I'm like tiptoeing a little bit because I don't want to say that people shouldn't do Shakespeare. Sure, people should do Shakespeare. And it's important. But I guess I also want to say that I think part of the revolution might be recalibrating the things that we value.
Yeah. And
recalibrating the standards of excellence that we so often uphold in the event. And that doesn't mean that Shakespeare goes away. It just means that we've got to look at this and revisit it through an anti-racist, anti-oppression lens.
Amen. And anti-sexist.
Absolutely, anti all the, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I often, you know, when I talk about these things, I often, I can see probably most quickly the ways in which anti-Blackness manifests in our field, in, you know, our standards of excellence, in the works of art that we uphold. But of course, there are so many levels of oppression that need to be dismantled.
Yeah, we have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to open this up now to questions from our audience. And we already have a question from an anonymous attendee, and they want to know what you think about the Q Brothers shows, if you've seen them at all. Are you familiar with the Q Brothers?
I am familiar with the Q Brothers. I like their shows. I do. I mean, Yeah, I always have a good time watching their shows. I think that I wish there was more. I mean, like, I feel like that kind of irreverence, that kind of play, that kind of pulling apart, that kind of audience engagement,
Theatricality.
Theatricality, all of it is interesting to me as an artist and as a producer.
I've never seen a Q Brothers production, but I've sold the shows before.
Yeah.
And I know that it involves hip hop.
Yep.
And they're white. And so talking about the erasure of blackness, I'm sure that they have critics that, you know, that this is an appropriation. Again, I haven't seen it, so I'm not speaking from experience, and this is not a critique that I hold myself. But do you find that their work is at all, and that they are appropriating Black culture?
That's a good question. You know, honestly, I don't know. I feel, first of all, I had no idea how they self-identified in terms of their racial identity, but regardless of how they self-identify, they're certainly white presenting. Yeah, and so there's a lot that comes with that. I think the Q Brothers absolutely should exist in an ecology where they're not the only ones doing hip hop interpretations of Shakespeare. That's highly problematic, right? And that's where it starts to feel, I don't know if I would say like cultural appropriation, but it feels like, yeah, it feels like erasure. But then we have to ask ourselves, you know, I think there are producers who would rather hire the Q Brothers than perhaps other artists, right? Black artists who are working in a hip hop paradigm.
Yeah.
You know, we could be commissioning them.
Yeah.
And not the Q Brothers. So is there some anti-Blackness happening in the sort of producerial decisions to uplift those shows over others?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What does your programming look like this season? And with that, I would love to take this opportunity to talk about an incredible human being who was the artistic director for Impact Theater in Chicago for a long time, Miss Carla Stillwell. And if you have not had the pleasure of meeting this woman, she is joy, she is light, she is love, she is healing. And I'm so excited to have her on the show in 2 weeks. Next week, we'll be joined by Miranda Gonzalez from Urban Theater Company, talking about the future of shows. Miranda! And this performance, this episode of The Arts with ESTIE, we will be donating some money to the Stillwell Institute, which you can go online at the stillwellinstitute.org, I believe, and make a donation as well. And this is such an incredible organization, whereas a lot of these theaters that we've been talking about are on the north side and downtown and serving a predominantly white audience. Carla Stillwell's Institute is a program that mentors artists from all genres and helps to facilitate Black artists within Black communities on the South Shore and Lawndale and all, and helps these Black artists fulfill their mission to create art. And I love that it's not just theater, it's visual art, it's music, it's whatever you can. And also we had a guest on one of our earlier webinars that was one of her fellows, at the Stillwell Institute. Nick, I forgot his last. Nick, do you know Nick Whitcomb? Was it? I think. But yeah, he is one of their fellows from 2019, and they will be having their virtual. They're going to be having a virtual performance in September. And it's the Southeast Performances Arts Festival. If you go to the stillwellinstitute.org, it's September 11th. Starts that weekend for 2 weekends. You can go and see the Southeast Performance Arts Festival. It'll be streaming live at the stillwellinstitute.org. So we're so happy to be shouting out to Carla Stillwell and the Institute and all the work that she does in helping Black artists heal through creating art. So thank you for that. I guess that's our commercial portion for the evening. One last thing, I'd like to go out on a quote, and it was something that you said in one of our many wonderful conversations that we've been having about living your life artistically, and it's about not being able to create during the pandemic and being an artist and like what defines an artist. But you talked about living creatively. It was something really beautiful, and I'm totally bastardizing it. But do you remember at all what I'm talking about?
Gosh, I have no idea.
you say these gems, these beautiful things, and it was something about like I'm less interested in defining my life or my worth by creating art, but living creatively.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. That's something. Yes, that's been my meditation over these past few months. You know, I spent several weeks doing some fundraising for the young woman whose video of George Floyd being murdered went viral. And
what's her name, the young woman?
Her name is Darnella Frazier.
Darnella Frazier.
Darnella Frazier, yes. There's a fund that's been established for her. But she, it really brought me back to, honestly, what's important. It brought me back to why I'm in the theater to begin with, right? Which is really to uplift stories like those. And I think sometimes we get so, or at least for myself, the past few years, I feel like I've been really caught up in the specialization of being a theater producer and everything that means, that I have felt disconnected from my own, the creativity in my everyday life, you know. And so I feel that I'm trying to reconnect to that. Ultimately, I think that will make me a better person, but also a better producer, a better advocate for artists, and a better activist. So that's my current meditation.
Beautiful. Mika, thank you so much for talking with us today on behalf of Acting Studio Chicago and the greater community of Chicago Theater. We're so grateful to have you, and a nationally recognized treasure of the American theater and revolutionary of what the future of theater is going to be. I can't wait to see all of those values that you hold and all of that spiritual power that's in you coming out once, and even before the pandemic. We'll have cocktails, we'll have Kiki, and we will revolutionize the future of American theater. Thank you so much.
We will.
Yes, awesome. Well, thank you so much, audience. Thank you, Mika. And we will see you all next week, Monday, with Miranda Gonzalez and Urban Theater Company. Thank you. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, all the participants. Thank you for coming. All right. Bye, Mika.
Bye.